The first talk is Case, a New Frontier in Public Key Authenticated Encryption. Manoj is going to give a talk.
Thank you. So this is joint work with Shashank Agarwal, Shweta Agarwal, Rajiv Rekmad, and Jair Singla. And what I'm going to tell you is a new way of doing publicly authenticated encryption. So I'll begin with what is CASE. So CASE stands for Completely Anonymous Signed Encryption. So it's a little bit like signed encryption, but our focus is on security. And it involves a sender who can use an encryption key for the receiver, their own signature key, signing key, and create a case packet. A case packet is the analog of a ciphertext, and send it out. And if the receiver has a decryption key and a verification key corresponding to the sender signing key, then they can retrieve the message and authenticate it. And we'd like to consider an adversary who's not just passively eavesdropping on all of this, but can also create malicious case packets, malicious public keys, and even malicious private keys, and get honest users to use them. And even in the face of such an adversary, we'd like our primitive to stay as close to ideal as possible. So what is ideal case? We could think of it in terms of a trusted third party or database. So the honest users, the senders, receivers, many of them, they can create idealized objects. Their idealized objects are created inside the database by the trusted party, and it just gives out handles to the users to operate on it. And similarly, the adversary can also create these objects, get handles, and they could also transfer their handles to each other. So the honest users can transfer some handles in their views to the adversary, and vice versa. And they can also talk to each other freely outside of this interaction with the trusted party. Okay, so that's what you would expect as an idealized world for authenticated encryption. And the kind of operations are what you would naturally expect. You can create key objects, idealized objects, case packets, and if you have the right kind of keys, you can decrypt them, so open them, create the messages. You can compare two objects and so forth. So it's a little bit like you could think of it as a generic group model kind of set. Okay, simple as it is, it comes with a lot of implications. So, for instance, so of course, some of them are more obvious than the others. So you cannot, find out what's the message inside a case packet if you don't have the decryption key. You cannot even tell who the signer is or which signing key was used, even if it was your signing key, a signing key that you maliciously created, unless you have the decryption key, you cannot tell this. And even if you have the decryption key, if you don't have the verification key, you cannot tell which signing key was used, and so forth. Or you create two case packets using maliciously created keys, they will not accidentally turn out to be the same case packet, stay different. So we collect a bunch of these requirements and form this definition called chosen objects attack security. It's a little bit like chosen ciphertext attack in PKE, but beyond ciphertext or case packets, we also allow the adversary to create their own malicious keys. So it's objects, and create all the objects maliciously. And these requirements are, there are a few game-based definitions of total hiding, sender anonymity, strong unforgeability. And there are a few other requirements, of course, correctness, unpredictability, and existential consistency, which essentially says that a case packet can have at most one set of public keys associated with it, and a public key can have at most one private key associated with it. Okay, so fairly natural set of requirements, but we should ask, is this comprehensive? Did we miss out any requirement? And that's where the next part of the work comes in, and that's this framework called active agents framework. So what we'd like to do is to have a real ideal definition, the real ideal paradigm, to make sure we are not missing out on any subtle attacks that we don't think of. And we already saw what ideal case is. That's easy enough to define. The tricky part is, what does it mean for something to be like ideal? What does it mean for a real implementation to emulate the ideal situation? And the difficulty is because simulation-based definitions, which is what we would naturally go for, turn out to be impossible. So what we do is use something called indistinguishability preserving security, which says that if two behaviors of the honesty system, or test, right? So two behaviors, test 0 and test 1, if they are indistinguishable from each other in the ideal world, then that should be the case even in the real. Okay, so that's indistinguishability preserved. And this is a definition we used in cryptographic agent framework, which is something some of the authors in this work introduced in a few years back. And that was in the context of primitives like obfuscation, functional encryption, where we only considered a passive adversary, eavesdropping adversary. Here, we also want to consider active adversaries. We can create malicious objects. So that's an extension to the framework that we do here, and that's what's called the activism. Now, even with this relaxation that we don't want simulation-based security, just indistinguishability preserving security, things still remain impossible to realize. So we need to make a couple of more restrictions. And one is we don't consider all possible behaviors of this test, only something we call delta tests. And also we only require statistical indistinguishability in the ideal world to be preserved as computational indistinguishability in the real world. So with these restrictions, we get a definition of delta S in security. And this pretty much covers all sorts of indistinguishability game-based definitions that you would come across, which like CCA security or anonymous CCA in the case of public key encryption. Now, of course, here this is not this is for case, not PKE. Nevertheless, the delta S in free security definition, which says real and ideal, and how real and ideal should be like each other, doesn't really care about what the primitive is, right? What exactly the primitive is all captured in the description of the ideal. So it's like the functionality in this work. So it's not all fitting to just the attacks we thought of. It's general security definition. And the main theorem, and most of the effort in this paper went into proving this, is that this list of properties that are listed in the beginning actually implies the security guarantee, the delta S. I'm not going to go into the proof of that. It's tedious, but and of course, it's because of that we wanted to prove is that particular list of properties is what we ended up with. Okay, so we do have a comprehensive security definition, and the next question is it achievable? And sure enough, it is. And our starting point is standard, traditional public key encryption with anonymous CCA security. And we also require a property called quasi-deterministic determinism. So this is essentially already achieved by Kramer-Shoup encryption, for instance. And the quasi-determinism property is just that the ciphertext comes in two pieces. The first piece entirely encodes the randomness, doesn't depend on the message. And the second part is completely determined once you have the message and the first information. And from this from Kramer-Shoup, we build something called COA secure quasi-deterministic PKE. So it's a little bit like our COA secure case, but simpler because it's only PKE. And when we use that to also do something for signatures, we get anonymous signatures, which have this existential consistency property mentioned. And we use both of these things together to finally build our case construction. Just to very quickly mention, to get from PKE to COA secure PKE, we need to add existential consistency. That's done carefully by adding commitments. Nothing too complicated, just need to be careful to avoid circular security kind of issues. And you can get this. And to get anonymous signatures, you add a layer of encryption, but the encryption is using a key public, a key, the secret key is part of the verification. So some encryption that you can remove if you have the verification key. And again, we need existential consistency. We rely on quasi-determinism here to say what we are going to sign is not just a message directly, but the message and the randomness used for the layer of encryption. That randomness as encoded by the first part of the sentence. And you put them together into case carefully again. And here again, when you start encrypting, so you create the randomness part, then you sign the message and the randomness together, and then you finish encrypting. And then signature scheme used is this one, and then encryption scheme used this. And it turns out it all works. And it's not necessarily the most efficient one if you're counting the number of group elements, but it doesn't really matter for large messages because hybrid encryption works, retains all the security properties we need if you do it properly. So you would use symmetric encryption and the quotient system have function keys of the encryption and the hash are what you encase. We'll put in the case packet. The rest of the message itself is encrypted using the SK. Okay, so it's not just achievable, it's practical too. And we hope it's something that can be implemented and actually used in practice. So these boxes you get at the end are fairly robust. You can throw it into any application and hopefully behave as ideally as we get them.
We have plenty time of question. So if you have. So is your construction is analyzed in the agent framework? Is there any relationship agent framework and the UC framework?
Yeah, so the agents framework is doesn't use simulation. So it's inspired by UC in the sense of real ideal, but it's it's its own definition. This delta S in principle.
Thanks. Any other question? Yeah, yes, thanks. Speak again. Okay, the next talk is lower bound on assumptions behind registration-based encryption. And Sarah is going to give a talk.
Hi, everyone. Today I'll be presenting our work, lower bounds and assumptions behind registration-based encryption. This is a joint work with my supervisor, Mohammad Hajiabadi, Mohammad Mahmoudi, and my team. So let's start with a quick review on public key encryption. Here we have Alice and her friend Bob. Alice wants to send Bob a private message, so Bob needs to have a public key and a secret key pair and send his public key to Alice. Which Alice can use to encrypt her message and send a ciphertext to Bob. And then Bob can later use his secret key to decrypt the ciphertext and retrieve the message. Now, something that's really important to note here is that Bob's public key could be something like this, which is really hard to memorize or remember. So later on, another friend of Alice comes, Charlie, and she also wants to send Charlie a private message, so she asks for Charlie's public key and then encrypt the message under that public key and send that to him. Later that day, Alice finds a new friend, Daisy, and she repeats the same process with Daisy, but Alice gets tired because this is just too many public keys to handle. Now, this may actually work in theory, but it needs an expensive key management infrastructure, which we don't like. And that's exactly why in 1986, Adi Shamir proposed identity-based encryption. So in identity-based encryption, we then have Alice and we have Bob, But this time we also have a third party called private key generator who generates a master secret key and a master public key or a public parameter. So now if Alice wants to send Bob a message, she can easily encrypt the message under Bob's identity, which could be his name, email, or something like that, and a public parameter, and send that to Bob. And when Bob wants to decrypt it, he should in some way prove his identity to the private key generator, who will then issue a secret key for Bob, and then Bob can use the secret key to decrypt the cipher and retrieve Alice's message. Now, this is really nice, right? Because Alice can now send all of her friends private messages without needing to know everyone's public key and only knowing one value, which is the public parameter. But then there's a new problem, and that's what if the PKG is compromised? So IB is known to have a problem called K-square problem. And so it means that we know that the private key generator has access to the master secret key. So you can generate all of the people's secret keys and then use the secret keys to decrypt ciphertext for everyone. So that means that we need to put a lot of trust in the authority, but it's not reasonable to give too much power to a third party. So that's why registration-based encryption was proposed. It was actually introduced by Garrett, Hajiabadi, Mahmoudi, and Rahimi in 2018 to address the key score problem of IBE. So in registration-based encryption, the private key generator who generates secret keys is replaced with a public key curator who aggregates public keys. This public key curator is totally transparent and has no secrets. And also, all of the users generate their own secret key in public keys. So let's take a closer look at the registration-based encryption. Like I said, the private key generator is replaced with a public key curator. So when Bob joins, what Bob needs to do is to generate a public key and a secret key pair for himself, and then send his identity together with his public key to the public key curator. And the public key curator will then run a publicly computable aggregation function on Bob's identity and Bob's public key, and then publicly announces the output, which is the public parameter or PP1 here. After that, Charlie joins. Again, he will generate a public key and a secret key pair for himself, and similarly, he will send his identity and his public key to the public key curator. Public key curator will again run his aggregation function on public key of Charlie and Charlie's identity and the previous public parameter, and then announces a new public parameter, which is PP2 here. So now, if Alice wants to send Bob a message, she can encrypt the message under Bob's identity and the public parameter. But how can Bob decrypt this? So in order for Bob to be able to decrypt this message, the public key curator will need to send Bob a hint or an update, which is, by the way, totally public and is only a function of the public parameter and Bob's identity. And then Bob can use this hint together with the secret key to decrypt the ciphertext and retrieve the message. So how do we construct an RBE? Let's say that we have n users and their public keys are PK1 through PKN. Then there's a trivial RBE escape in which we can set the public parameter to be all of the public keys of all users concatenated with each other. And then if we want to encrypt a message for someone with identity I, we can easily encrypt the message with the ith public key. And the ith person can obviously decrypt this message successfully. But this is not interesting at all, because here the size of the public parameter grows linearly with the number of users, but the whole point in using IBE was to have a single compact public parameter instead of all of the public keys. So we need to set some limits on the RBE to be efficient. Again, suppose that we have n users. So what we want is for the public parameter to be compact, meaning that we want the public parameter size to be polylogarithmic in terms of n. We also need to set some constraints on the number of updates or hints that each user receives, but it's not in the context of this. So now, with this new efficient definition of RBE, let's look at the existing constructions. So the original paper that introduced RBE constructed RBE from indistinguishability obfuscation, and the subsequent work built RBE from garbled circuits. But both of the works used their side assumptions, which was LWE or CDH in a non-black box. So at that time, we knew that RBE can be constructed based on basic assumptions like LWE or CDH. Then what are we looking for? What is the problem here? So generally, non-black box constructions are less efficient than black box constructions. So even if we know how to do something in a non-black box way, it's always a good idea to go after black box constructions. So let me tell you what we have about black box constructions. Hohenberger et al. And Glaser et al. Both constructed RBE in a black box way from bilinear maps. But assuming the common reference string or CRS whose length can grow with the number of registered users. Now, something that's really important to note here is that this CRS is not an input to the encryption algorithm. The encryption algorithm only depends on the public parameter, which is still compact and independent of the number of users. Also, Duckling et al. Constructed RBE in a black box way from LWE. So now that we know that RBE can be constructed in a black box way from bilinear maps or LWE, the question is that can we also construct RBE without these assumptions? Or in other words, what are the minimal assumptions for black box constructions are? So in our work, we showed that RBE cannot be built in a black box way from trapdoor permutations or in Shoup's generic group model. And both of these impossibility results also hold even if there's a CRS whose length can grow polynomially with the number of users. So one thing that you might ask yourself is that why did we choose these assumptions? Why trapdoor permutations in Shoup's generic group model? So the reason is that we know public encryption is necessary for building RBE in a black box way. But the question is it also sufficient? So if we rule out black box construction of RBE from TDP, we also rule out black box construction of RBE from any primitive that can be built from TDP in a black box way, including collision-resistant hash function and public encryption. So by ruling out black box construction of RBE from TDP, we can answer the first question with a no. Also, similarly, if we rule out black box construction of RBE in the generic group model, we can rule out black box construction of RBE from assumptions that hold in this model, like decisional or even strong assumptions. Another thing that you might ask yourself is that can we just use the previous separations, black box separations for IBE? Because we know that IBE cannot be constructed in a black box way from trapdoor permutations or in Shoup's generic group model. So don't these results just immediately apply to RBE? The answer is no, and that's because we don't know if RBE implies IBE in a black box way. We do know that it implies IBE in a non-black box way, but this connection is not sufficient to rule out those constructions and prove the separation. So we're going to prove our separation with respect to a black box equivalent of RBE called public key compression replicator. And instead of using the combinatorial ideas that are behind the existing IBE separations and are not applicable to our settings, we develop new compression techniques and use them to prove our separation. So what is this public key compression? The difference between public key compression and the regular registration-based encryption is that all of the users join in parallel in the public key compression. So the users will first generate their public key and secret key pairs, and then they will send their identities and their public keys to the public key curator at the same time. And the public key curator will only run the public aggregation function once and outputs the public parameter or key. Now, this version may look weaker, but it's actually black box equivalent of RBE. So our impossibility results also generalize to RBE. So let's talk more about the high-level idea behind our proof. Let's say that we have a TDP oracle with three algorithms, G, E, and G. G takes as input a trapdoor key and outputs an index key. And let's call an index key valid if it's in the output space of the oracle G. So the main thing that we're going to prove and use in our proofs is that compacted strings cannot signal too many trapdoors. And in order to prove this, we use a lemma called compression lemma, which I will explain very informal here. So we have this TDP oracle, and we have an adversary who can query this oracle as many times as he wants. And after all of these queries, we should output an advice string or PP with size less than n and send that to another adversary, E. Eve can also query the TDP oracle, but this time we can only query the oracle polynomial number of times. And at the end, we should output a list of index keys. Now we say Eve was successful in this game if this list has two conditions. First of all, it has n distinct valid labels, and then none of these labels were generated as an output the query that Eve has made to G before. So the compression lemma says that probability of success for Eve in this game is negligible. And we proved this based on the compression techniques that were initially introduced by General and Trebison. So now we proved that compact strings cannot signal too many trapdoors. And we can use this to show that a public parameter of size less than n cannot embed n public keys. So for at least one identity, the message is encrypted to that identity can be decrypted using secret keys of other people. And that proves our black box separation. So let me quickly tell you how our work is different from prior impossibility results on IBE and why those techniques don't apply here. So the existing IBE separation proofs rely on the fact that the running time of setup algorithm that generates master secret key and public parameter in IBE is bounded. But in fact, in RBE, the running time of the algorithm that generates a public parameter could grow with the number of users. So we can't use the same techniques to prove that a compact string cannot signal too many trapdoors. For the generic proof model, we also use the same approach, which I won't explain here because of the time constraints. But we informally proved that a compact public parameter cannot encode enough information to securely encrypt more than a bounded number of users. So to conclude, we proved the first black box separation of RBE, in which we say that it's not possible to build RBE in a black box way from trapdoor permutations or a Shubsbury proof model. And we also developed new compression techniques that can be used individually. And that's it. Thank you.
Time for question. Is there any question? Let's thanks the speaker again. The next talk is security with functional re-encryption from CPA, and Shai is going to give a talk.
Thank you. Right, so I'll talk about security with functional re-encryption from CPA. That's joint work with Evgeny Dodis and Daniel Wicks. And what I'm going to talk about is a notion of security, which is called functional CPA, which is a notion of security for encryption scheme that lies somewhere in between chosen plaintext and chosen ciphertext security. That notion was introduced by Akavia et al. In TCC of last year. And roughly speaking, it's very similar to CCA in the sense that the attacker gets an oracle that it can query, but instead of decrypting, this oracle does re-encryption. It decrypts and then re-encrypts and send the result ciphertext back to the adversary. Actually, you can get a little more general than that. You can make a functional re-encryption queries. That is many ciphertext and a function, and then the oracle decrypts all of these ciphertext, applies the function, and encrypts the result. What's interesting about this notion? Isn't it just simply implied by CPA security? After all, the attacker only sees valid ciphertext. Turns out that that's not the case. Akavia et al. Had a surprising example of a CPA secure scheme where a single query to a re-encryption oracle reveals the decryption key. And the point is, the adversary can send invalid ciphertext to be decrypted and re-encrypted, the decryption query can do very funky things on these invalid ciphertext, so funky that even once you encrypt them back, it's still a security problem. So that makes functional CPA an interesting notion to study, and it's on even beyond the original motivation that Kavya and Al had for a fully homomorphic encryption type. So I want to spend a minute showing you why that notion might be interesting, even when you're not talking about homomorphic encryption scheme. So imagine that we want to, that I want to set up a secure enclave to carry computation. So the enclave will have a key inside of it, and clients can send encrypted things under the public key, and then perhaps a function, and the enclave will do exactly what the functional re-encryption oracle does. It decrypt, because it has the secret key, apply the function, and send back the result encrypted back to the client, and you can repeat that. So that's exactly the functional CPA attack model. And just like in CCA security, you can think of all kinds of settings where you want to protect things against a client like that. Either there are multi-user setting and some users can be adversarial, or a network adversary that can play man in the middle, or send the ciphertext to be re-encrypted. So what we ask in this work is, where does it lie? So it's very easy to see that it's implied by CCA security and implies CPA security, but is it closer to one or the other? Can you construct functional CPA secure encryption just based on CPA secure encryption? Or can you construct CCA secure encryption based on functional CPA? And while we're at it, can you do it with a black box transformation? So in this work, we show that functional CPA is closer to CPA security. The theorem that we prove is that func CPA secure encryption can be constructed from any CPA secure encryption via black box transformation. The main technical observation is that you can take transformations from the literature that were introduced in the context of transforming CPA secure encryption to non-malleable secure encryption, and use them also in the context of functional CPA security. But the adaptation is not straightforward, because those techniques were devised for non-adaptive decryption queries. And here we need to use them in the context of adaptive re-encryption queries. And I'll explain about it in a couple of slides. But for now, let's look at the definition of func CPA secure encryption. So the adversary gets an oracle, and that oracle is either this functional re-encryption oracle that I talked about before, that decrypts everything, applies the function, and then re-encrypts, or just a worthless oracle that encrypts always zeros. And the adversary's job is to tell which is the case. And the advantage of the adversary is how much it can get better than a random guess, and it would be secure if the advantage is negligible. So that's a natural definition. And the main tool that we use in order to show that you can construct things like that from CPA secure encryption is this transformation of Cho et al. I guess 2018 was the journal version. It's a transformation from 2008, if I remember correctly, that describes the black box construction of non-malleable encryption from CPA secure. So very quickly, non-malleable security is very similar to CCA security, except the adversary only have a single decryption query that it can use. It can ask for as many ciphertexts as it wants, but only once. So just like CCA secure encryption, you have the public key, you have the two target plain text, one of them gets encrypted, then the adversary gets to use it in its decryption oracle, but only once. Can query for a vector of ciphertext as long as it wants. It gets the corresponding plain text, and then it needs to guess whether the PK, the plain text 0 or plain text 1 were the ones that went. What we show is that the exact same transformation yields functional CPA security, but only if the underlying scheme is already non-malleable. So if you want to get functional CPA encryption, secure encryption from CPA secure encryption, then you could apply once the transformation to get non-malleability, and then apply yet again to get functional CPA secure. Now, I'm not going to have time to show you the transformation at all, but I will give you a hint about what the difference is in the proof of security from the original joint algorithm. So valid ciphertext after that transformation has certain structure. And in the analysis in the proof of security, there is a bad event in which the adversary sends for the decryption oracle invalid ciphertexts, but the decryption procedure fails to detect that these are invalid. And as long as that bad event doesn't happen, then the rest of the proof is fairly straightforward. So the main thing is to show that this bad event rarely happens. And in the original transformation to get non-malleability, you can actually have an information theoretic argument saying that this bad event almost never happens because each public key has associated with many different secret keys. Most of them, almost all of them, will detect that for every fixed invalid ciphertext, almost all of them will detect that this ciphertext is indeed invalid. And until the adversary uses its decryption query, it has no idea which of them is actually used. So really, it cannot send almost never invalid ciphertext that will not get caught. And that's enough to show non-malleability. But in our case, we need to handle adaptive oracle queries. So the adversary can send queries, and then the query will either detect or not detect that it's an invalid ciphertext. And based on whether or not it detected, the adversary can get some information about what secret key is used. However, the question of whether it was detected or not is sort of hidden behind the fact that the adversary doesn't get the decryption. It only gets a re-encryption of that thing. So it's hidden behind the encryption. What it boils down to is we cannot have an information theoretic argument anymore. We need to go for a computational argument, namely a reduction. So we need to have a separate reduction showing that the bad event doesn't happen based on this CPA security or the non-malleable security of the underlying encryption scheme. And the idea here is, well, we need to set up a reduction. The reduction does need to know whether or not the bad event happened. How can we let the reduction know whether it happened or not? Well, obviously, we can, if we give the reduction a decryption oracle, then it can check for itself whether the bad event happened or not. But the point is, it's enough to give it a non-adaptive access to the decryption oracle because the reduction can run the whole game all through the end. And at the very end, just take all the ciphertext that the adversary ever submitted and ask the decryption oracle to decrypt. In other words, we get a reduction to the non-malleability of the underlying scheme. So with that, I'm more or less done. We show that applying this transformation of joint al twice yields functional CPA secure encryption, starting from CPA secure encryption. Whether or not we really need to apply it twice, well, we don't know. On one hand, the reduction that we describe absolutely needs the underlying thing to be non-malleable security. We don't know how to prove it from CPA security if you only apply the transformation once. On the other hand, we don't have a counterexample. And in fact, we have some arguments saying that a counterexample cannot be too simple for whatever that means. Are there other transformations that are simpler? We don't know that either. Maybe for the special case of non-functional re-encryption problem, where you don't apply function. Perhaps, we don't know. And of course, whether there are other applications of that security notion. That would be nice to know. So that's all I have to say.
Time for questions. Is there any question?
Yeah, Shai. So how specific is the CDMW technique for your result? Like if I give you a generic black box transformation from CPA to non-malleable and you applied it twice, would it give you this?
So I can't say about every transformation, but every transformation that we know of would work. So there are like 3 or 4 different transformations in the literature, and each one of them, if you start from a non-malleable secret and apply that transformation, you get a fun CPA.
Do you know what
That's
is?
an interesting question of whether it's generic. I don't think it's generic, honestly.
You can't say what the property is that you use.
the only thing that I said, the only thing that I can say is what I had in the slide. That is the SPAT event thing, and current transformation work this way. So yes.
Other questions? No? Let's speak again. Okay. Okay. The next talk is revisiting updatable encryption, controlled forward security, constructions, and punctuable perspective. And Roman is going to give a talk instead of the authors.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. So this is a work by Daniel Slammerning and Christoph Strix, who unfortunately both could not attend, so I will present on their behalf. So I'm sure you all very well know, if you use a public key encryption scheme, only the public key is supposed to become public. But that sounds very easy in theory, but in practice, unfortunately, mistakes happen, usually due to human error. And sometimes also the private key is leaked. So these are just two of countless examples where this happened. And that usually is a disaster, because if your key leaks, then everything that has been encrypted under this key is in danger. And one strategy to mitigate the damage of such a key leakage is forward security, which basically just means we want some guarantees that old data is safe even if your key gets leaked at a later point. And for example, this has become mandatory in TLS 1.3, and also all big tech companies have recognized the importance of this. And several cryptographic schemes have been considered in a variant that provides forward security. So for example, key exchange, public key encryption, signatures, and many, many more, as you can see on this slide. But this is the first work that looks into forward security for updatable encryption, and this has not been achieved before. So let me briefly explain what updatable encryption is. It's a symmetric encryption scheme that has an additional feature to rotate encryption keys for outsourced ciphertext. So imagine, for example, you have your data stored encrypted on a cloud server, and now you want to change the key. What you can do is to download all your data, decrypt it, re-encrypt it, and upload it again, but that's very cumbersome. And updatable encryption gives you a more elegant way to do this. So key generation works for any symmetric encryption scheme and also encryption. But then you have this next key functionality that takes as input the key and outputs a new key together with an update token, this delta 2 here. And then there's the update procedure. So this update token can then be sent, for example, to your cloud server. And the cloud server can use this update method to the text input the ciphertext and the update token, and outputs a new ciphertext that can now be decrypted under the new key. And security is usual indistinguishability of ciphertext, and the adversary can choose the epoch and is given access to both keys and tokens as long as they do not trivially decrypt the challenge ciphertext. So even if you're changing the keys here, this does not give you forward security at all. And the reason is that the adversary can learn the update tokens in the security game. And so if your key does get leaked at some later point, an adversary who has access to the update tokens can decrypt all previous ciphertext, because he can just update the ciphertext to the epoch where the key leaked and then decrypt them. So this seems to be this is an inherent problem with updatable encryption. And looking forward, this work solves this by restricting the update functionality so that old ciphertext at some point cannot be updated anymore, even if you have the update tokens. So the starting building block of their construction is symmetric punctuable encryption, which is a tag-based encryption scheme with a very fine-grained forward security guarantee. So it has the usual key generation. Encryption now takes as input, along with the key and the message, a tag. and will output a ciphertext associated to this tag. And you have a puncturing method that takes as input a key and a tag, and then outputs a key that is punctured as at this tag, which means that this new key can no longer be used to decrypt ciphertext associated to such a tag, but it can still decrypt all ciphertext associated to different tags. And you can repeat this puncturing over and over again so that you can puncture your key at many points. And yeah, this gives you forward security because, for example, what you can do is that whenever you get a ciphertext, you decrypt it, and then you puncture your key at the tag of the ciphertext, so you kind of cannot decrypt it again. So if this key gets leaked at some point, it cannot be used to decrypt any ciphertext that you have received in the past. And security is the usual indistinguishability game. The adversary can choose the tag and gets access to punctured keys to keys as long as they are all punctured on the tag of the challenge ciphertext. And a special case of this puncturable encryption is epoch-based puncturable encryption, where we no longer have tags, but instead we have linearly evolving epochs. And key generation will give us a key for the first epoch. And encryption now takes as input just a key and a message and will output a ciphertext for the same epoch as the key. And the puncturing now just takes a key and outputs a key for the next epoch. And the properties is, well, this new key, or here the key for the second epoch, can no longer be used to decrypt ciphertext associated to the first epoch. Note that here there's no way to update the ciphertext to new epoch, so that's the difference to updatable encryption. And this gives a very coarse-grained type of forward security. And yeah, in order for this to be useful, we need to make it more fine-grained. And this is why this work introduces tag inverse puncturable encryption, or for short TIPE. So that's the main contribution of this work. So to define this and to give a construction of this. And the idea is to start with epoch-based puncturable encryption, but exclude certain ciphertexts from the epoch-based puncturing, and also to add expiry epochs. So concretely, as before, key generation gives you a key for the first ciphertext, but encryption now also takes as new inputs a tag and an expiry epoch. And the tag has nothing to do with the epochs. Key puncturing, as before, takes as input a key and outputs a key for the next epoch. But optionally, you can now also provide some tags. And for each of the tags you provide, it will output a token. And this token can be used to exclude the ciphertext from puncturing. So more concretely, there is this exclude puncturing procedure, which takes as input a ciphertext and such a token. And the token has to be for the same tag and the next epoch. And then it will output a new ciphertext for the next epoch, and tag and expiry epoch remain unchanged. And the guarantee is that this new ciphertext can now be decrypted under the new key as long as the expiry epoch has not been reached. So yes, its security is the usual indistinguishability of ciphertext. The adversary can choose here the epoch, and he can also get access to keys and tokens as long as they don't give them a trivial win. And maybe this already looks a bit like updatable encryption. And it is indeed this kind of updatable encryption, but with additional features. So the key puncturing is more or less our update key mechanism. These tokens are the update tokens, and the exclude puncturing procedure can be seen as a way to update the ciphertext. So they construct tag inverse punctual encryption, and this in particular implies updatable encryption with expiring ciphertext, which is a forward secure variant of updatable encryption. And updatable encryption with expiring ciphertext also implies plain updatable encryption. This works by setting the expiry epoch to something exponential in the security parameter so that it will never be reached. And the security notion they define for updatable encryption with expiring ciphertext also implies the CPA security notion for plain updatable encryption schemes. And when you plug in the construction they have for tag inverse punctuable encryption and use this as a plain updatable encryption scheme, they also get the first backward leak updatable encryption scheme with sublinear ciphertext from standard assumption, which solves an open problem posed in 2 recent works. And I don't have time to go into the technical part, but let me just say that they use dual system groups, which have been used previously to achieve adaptivity for IBE schemes, for example. And yeah, it's interesting to see them now in the context of updatable encryption. Okay, so let me summarize. Forward security is an essential security feature and for many cryptographic primitives. And this works looks into forward security for updatable encryption and therefore introduces tag inverse punctuable encryption. And yeah, this is quite a versatile cryptographic primitive. And yeah, an interesting direction to look into is whether this can be used for other applications than updatable encryption. Thank you.
Can you ask questions instead of the authors?
Yeah, I think it would be better if you send questions to the authors. I'm not sure if I can answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's speak again. The last talk of this session is combinatorially homomorphic encryption, and ER is going to give a talk.
Thank you. Okay, so this talk is about homomorphic encryption, and it's going to work with Yuval Shai and Ron Rothblum. So homomorphic encryption, introduced by Rebbe Stadelman and Virtuosos, is a general idea of an encryption scheme that allows computation over the encrypted data. And intuitively, it means that given a function f and an encryption of x, we can efficiently compute something that behaves like an encryption of f of x. It is a very useful notion with many applications, such as online voting and outsourced computation, and also many instantiations over the years. However, when we try to formally define it, we stumble upon a number of issues. For example, requiring the scheme to support the evaluation of every possible function turns out to be very hard to achieve. And on the other hand, supporting the evaluation of a single function can be trivially achieved by any encryption scheme, and it is not clear where is the threshold. And also, another example is whether the output of the evaluation algorithm needs to be distributed like valid encryption, and if not, what is the requirement? So let's take a look at existing definition for HE. So in the HE world, we divide time into 2 periods, BG and AG, before Gen 3 and after Gen 3. And before Gen 3, when we said HE, we mainly refer to the linearly or additively HE definition, which is inspired by the algebraic notion of homomorphism. The plaintext and the ciphertext spaces are both groups, while the encryption algorithm is homomorphism between them. Now, the main issue with this definition is that it captures mostly number theoretic-based schemes, and in particular, it doesn't exactly capture lattice-based schemes. It only supports bounded number of linear operations, and also it doesn't capture, of course, non-linear homomorphisms such as the FHE. Since Gen 3, the common definition uses the compactness property. Here we say that a scheme is homomorphic with respect to some fixed circuit class. And given a circuit from this class and encryption of some X, we can efficiently compute something that can be decrypted to the output of the circuit on X. And the key property for non-triviality here is compactness, which roughly means that the size of the output of the evaluation algorithm is smaller than the size of the circuit representation. Now, defining HE this way also has a couple of issues. First of all, it brings us back to the question from the start of the talk, which is what circuit classes should we support? Supporting every possible circuit class is only an FHE, and moreover, there are many HE schemes that only supported bounded, doesn't support every possible circuit class and still found to be useful. Also, it isn't clear what is the minimal notion of compactness. There are a number of different interpretations in the literature. And also, as you can see, this definition is model dependent, and questions that arise are, for example, why circuits, which circuits, and why not other models of computation. Okay, so our goal in this work is to propose a canonical definition for HE that will help basically the standard cryptographic primitive. And we want the definition to be clean, minimal, and model independent. We wanted to capture schemes that are traditionally considered homomorphic. And we wanted to respect the relations between HE and other cryptographic primitives. And we propose to do it using, from the lens of a combinatorial measure, and specifically communication complexity in this dimension, but mostly communication complexity, and this is what I will focus on right now. So a quick introduction to communication complexity. The setting is that we have two parties, Alice and Bob, and we have a function and input distribution. An input where is sampled, and Alice gets X while Bob gets Y. And now Alice needs to send some message to Bob, and Bob needs to output f of xy with high probability. Now, there are no secrecy requirements, so the trivial solution is for Alice to just send her entire input. However, for some function, she may be able to send a shorter message, and the communication complexity of the function over the input distribution is the minimal number of bits Alice has to send so they can compute the function correctly with high probability. Okay. Now, for our HE definition, so given a private key encryption scheme, we say it's communication complexity homomorphic or CC homomorphic if it is semantically secure. So this excludes, for example, textbook RSA. And if there exists some function and some efficiently samplable product input distribution, such that on the one hand, computing it requires C bits of communication, but on the other hand, if Alice and Bob are both computationally bounded, and we give Alice an encryption of Bob's input, and we give Bob the secret key, then they can compute it using less than C bits of communication, less than the lower bound of the standard set. And I will call this setting the homomorphic setting. And also we can adapt this entire definition to a public encryption. Okay, so we have a definition and we believe it's clean and minimal and it is model independent. And so the first natural question is whether it captures schemes that are traditionally considered homomorphic. And so our first theorem is that any linearly HE scheme is in fact CC homomorphic, and this captures, for example, Goldwasser-Micali and Gamal, Paillier, Regev, and more. And as a theoretical example, we will prove at the same time that any scheme that is homomorphic with respect to the OR function over binary inputs is also CC homomorphic. So we use the inner product communication complexity problem over random vectors. And for the second theorem, we use the same function, but with a different input distribution where Alice gets a random binary vector and Bob gets a random unit vector. This is an example of how it is sufficient for us to find even a specific, very tailor-made input distribution that works to instantiate as definition. So it is an only result in communication complexity that computing the function over both of these input distribution requires omega and bits of communication. However, consider the following protocol in the homomorphic setting, where Alice is given bit encryption of Bob's input, and she homomorphically computes the inner product function, which of course she can do with the linearly HE scheme, but she can also do it with the OR homomorphic scheme over this specific input distribution. And now Bob can decrypt it, and since Alice sent only a single ciphertext, then the communication of this protocol is less than the lower bound of the standard setting, and therefore the scheme is CC homomorphic. Okay, so the next natural question is whether the definition respects the relations between HE and other cryptographic primitives. So we know that linearly HE implies public key encryption, collision-resistant hashing, and private information retrieval. And in the paper, we indeed show that CCHE also implies PKE, or moreover, lossy PKE, reproducing the result by Rothblum. And assuming additional natural requirements, it also implies CRH, producing the result by Shah et al. And a stronger but closely related variant we present in the paper called VCHE implies P, reproducing the result by Kushilov-Ostrovsky. Now, the fact that we need slight variations of the definition to get a different primitive seems inherently required to us. And also, it kind of distills the minimal notion of HE that each of the primitives needs. Okay, so let's take a look, for example, on a non-interactive key exchange protocol that can be used to construct the PKE scheme. And this is a generalization of a Rothblum construction. So we start with a private key CCHE scheme with respect to some function and input distribution. And by the CCHE definition, there exists some protocol in the homomorphic setting for the function. So now the receiver samples an input for Bob, Y, and a private key K, and he sends the public key Y and the encryption Y. Now, this seems absurd. Like, why would you encrypt something and then reveal it right away? It seems not very useful. But in fact, it is useful because now the sender can sample an input for Alice, X, and he can send the message of Alice from the homomorphic protocol on X and the encryption of Y. And now both parties can compute f of xy. The sender can do it directly, while the receiver can do it using Bob and the message from Alice. And f of xy will be the agreed secret. For security, we first switch from the regular public key to a lossy public key by replacing the encryption of y by an encryption of independently sampled y prime. And now, assuming towards a contradiction that the adversary can predict f of xy given the transcript, we can construct a protocol in the standard communication complexity setting that will break the lower bound, which is of course impossible. So the protocol will use shared randomness that we can eliminate later. The parties will use it to sample identical encryption of some y prime. And Alice in the new protocol will use Alice from the homomorphic protocol to generate a message to send to Bob. And by the CCHE definition, this message is shorter than the communication complexity of the function. And now Bob can use the adversary to predict f of xy. And again, this protocol breaks the lower bound. It cannot be correct, and therefore the adversary cannot be correct. Okay, to show the versatility of the definition, we also show in the paper that it captures schemes that are not traditionally considered homomorphic. For example, encryption from low noise LPN. And this requires a different set of parameters for the CC game, namely weak correctness. And therefore, we get PK and CRH, but we don't get peer in this weak correctness regime. And this produces recent results for low noise LPN, but we believe it does it in a conceptually simpler way. Okay, so for summary, we propose a new canonical definition for HE called CCHE. We believe it is clean and minimal, and it is model independent. It captures schemes that are traditionally considered homomorphic, and it implies PKE, and the slight variations of it imply CRH and peer. And therefore, we propose it as a standard notion, a default notion for HE. Okay, thank you.
We have a lot of time for questions. Is there any question? Hi. Hello. Hi. Thank you for the talk. So I was wondering, do you draw any relationships between the CCHE and the previous definition of HE, or is it just
Yeah,
the-
so
the-
we
okay.
showed that the linear HE, which is kind of the standard definition for HE, implies a CCHE. And the default notion of HE currently, which is the second I showed with the circuit class, it doesn't really define well because you don't know which circuit class the scheme is required to support. So the linear HE is the more well-defined definition, and it is implied CCHE.
Other questions? Okay, let's thanks to speak again. This is the end of this session. Coffee break.